to introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Eric Wiseman. Eric and I have been friends for, going on 5 years now, and he's one of the charter members, along with Marie Ann, of our coffee party group. And it's just a real pleasure for me, and I'm sure for you also, to have Eric, Dr. Wiseman, Dr. Eric, speak to us this morning. So without further ado,
all this for you, huh? Man, you make a big splash.
I don't get my wish
Wondering.
list for
Hold on.
showing slides.
Yeah, the tables are easy to move.
Just ask me, it's plain and simple.
If we could have a little bit darker in here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
God.
Well, I usually don't speak on this topic. The last time I spoke on this topic, it was probably 25 years ago. A lot has happened at the Harvard Semitic Museum since I left there. I went on to less significant things, medical school, becoming a doctor. And usually I speak on topics related to dysfunction of the brain and specifically language. I gave a rather lengthy talk on aphasia, which is the loss of ability to use language at the University of Kentucky Medical Center. And it occurred to me in the midst of that talk that someday I would be able to talk about the origins of language, which is something I want to cover here. But I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do a good job of it. We'll see. In the course of this talk, I'm going to present some amazing bits of archaeology and also some parallel stories. One deals with the history of the Semitic Museum and how it almost disappeared from the face of the earth because of politics. And also, I also want to tie in some way, since as I was putting the finishing touches on this talk, I learned from a call from Mary Ann that JP is not well, so I changed the talk a little bit to add a slide in here that has something to do with him. If we go back to the origins of my involvement with the Semitic Museum, there's a legend that somehow when I began as a graduate student at Harvard, and this is what I looked like back then. I looked like a Harvard person. I was studying neuroscience, and I wanted to find a shortcut to the medical school because half my classes were at Harvard Medical School. And I went into the tunnel system in Harkness Commons, which is the dining facility for the graduate dorm I lived in, and it connects with the law school tunnel system. And if you make the right turns underground, you emerge right at the bus stop for the bus that takes you across the river to the medical school. Well, legend has it, I made a wrong turn. This is my dorm room at Child Hall at Harvard. And I made a wrong turn from Child Hall underground and ended up at the Semitic Museum instead of the medical school, and encountered Tutankhamun, prince, or king, and fell in love with archaeology, and because of this mummy. Well, actually, that's not what happened. It was this mummy, my mother, who got me involved through competition mostly in archaeology. She was, at this time, it's probably 1960, decided to forego her career in opera with the Boston Opera. There were two things going on. One was Beverly Sills, the prima donna mezzo-soprano, was coming up through the ranks and her understudy, and it was becoming apparent that she was better than my mother. And the other thing that happened was she had me, and I was a handful. So she decided to begin a second career, as it turned out, in Near Eastern languages and archaeology. And as she was coming up through the ranks at Harvard, she encountered Carney Gavin. Gee whiz, I want to go back.
Back arrow on the bottom.
See, I told you it would do that. Now, I'm giving this talk today. I was asked to speak, and I didn't know what I was going to speak about. But 2.5 weeks ago, Carney Gavin passed on. We lost Carney Gavin. And he was one of 2 or 3 very important people in my life, because he was the second person to come along. The first was my rabbi, who said it was okay, being a purebred Levite, to not become a rabbi, which I didn't want to do. I had no interest in becoming a rabbi. He said, if you take your studies seriously as an archaeologist, you will go on to great things. Well, I didn't pay any attention to him, and I became a doctor. But he did take me under his wing, allowed me to work as one of many volunteers at the Semitic Museum as an artist, as it turns out. And I dedicate this talk to Carney Gavin. Carney Gavin became the curator of the Harvard Semitic Museum when he finished his graduate studies at Harvard in 1973. Around the time that I was beginning to get into competition with my mother. We were both part-time students, we'll say, at Harvard. I was still in high school and starting to take courses at Harvard University as an undergrad. And Carney was a wonderful, wonderful man. He's not only was the, until very recently, the curator of the Semitic Museum, but he was a university chaplain at Harvard and the head of the Brighton Archdiocese, the Catholic Church. So he would, I would run into him later on in my career as the pastor of several of the major hospitals in Boston. And he did many, many things. One of the things he did is he fought a war that I didn't know about with the administration of Harvard to not only keep the Semitic Museum open, but to fight for funding from overseas to advance Near Eastern languages and archaeology at that institution. I want to go back up just a little bit to put this in perspective. You know, Harvard started off as the first college in our country back in the early 1600s, and at that point they were charged with the responsibility of educating clergy in the Puritan faith. As a matter of fact, except for the first president, Mr. Dunster, who was not trained at Harvard because Harvard didn't exist, all of the university presidents until Charles William Eliot in 1869 became the first president who was not a member of the clergy. He was trained at Harvard as an undergraduate. He took some time off. He learned about the polytechnic universities in Europe. He ended up be one of the first students at MIT, which at the time was situated in Boston, not in Cambridge. And they decided that they wanted to take this young professor, Charles William Eliot, on as the next, I think, the 13th president of Harvard College, so that they might merge Harvard and MIT. Dr. Eliot was the longest acting president at Harvard. He brought us out of the age of students learning just the classics and thought that we should learn about chemistry, physics, math, archaeology, the arts, and he really changed Harvard. And for that reason, he is also the longest tenured president at Harvard. For 40 years, he was the president. And a lot of the growth of Harvard and a lot of the young students who would come to Harvard and go on to careers and things other than the clergy developed. So we owe a lot to William Eliot. And you'll notice he stepped down in 1909. Well, the Semitic Museum started in 1906. It was at the end of his tenure. And because of a large chunk of money that was donated by a Jewish European family, we were able to begin to study archaeology at Harvard around the turn of the century. And for the purpose of promoting an understanding between the Semitic cultures and to kind of dampen anti-Semitism, which was just starting to develop in this country around that time. This is what the Semitic Museum looked like in 1906. The next president came along, Abbott Lawrence Lowell. He was, unlike the previous president, he was not a Unitarian. In fact, that was our first Unitarian at Harvard, the one who did all the great things. Abbott Lawrence Lowell was probably, among other things, an anti-Semite. He wanted to see there be far less than 27% Jewish people in the student body, which is what we had at Harvard around the time that he took over. There were concerns in the money, in the source of the endowment, which were the graduates, and people were now entering into industry and things other than the clergy. There were concerns that if there were too many Jewish people and black people and Catholics at Harvard, nobody would want to go there and nobody would want to give them money. So he instituted, or attempted to institute, all sorts of changes at Harvard that would prevent blacks and Jews, and to a lesser extent Catholics, from attending there. And this was not accepted by the board and by the students and the faculty. But nevertheless, he made some changes. One of the first things he did is he broke the promise to the Near Eastern Languages and Archaeology division. He cut off the funding to the Semitic Museum. He wouldn't even pay their electric bill or their gas bill, and forced them to go out and find funding. He also repurposed the Semitic Museum so that it would have to share its footprint with, at first, the U.S. Army and then the Navy. And he did other things. He turned churches into dining halls for wealthy people at Harvard. This kind of reminds me of a Harry Potter movie. It still exists, by the way. He took all the display cases that were at the Semitic Museum and had them tossed out the window from the second floor into a truck. So you had all these very nice oak presentation cases. And he basically wiped the top 3 floors clean and brought the military in. Which is interesting, because at the time we were getting involved in World War I and then World War II. So, you know, I could see sharing it. But then along comes this guy. Anybody know who this is?
Henry Kissinger.
That's right. He was a young professor at Harvard, and he started the Center for International Affairs, the CFIA, sorry. And it was also the beginning of the Council of Foreign Relations, which hand in hand the military-industrial complex. So these people were doing some nefarious things at the Semitic Museum that had nothing to do with Near Eastern languages and archaeology. And the student body kind of protested a bit, and in 1970 there was a bombing of the Center for International Affairs. This slide I put in there for Dean. Is he in here?
Yeah.
Right, there you are. Right there. Let's see, $20,000 worth of damage was done. Here's the mention of the General Motors strike that I talked about yesterday when we were having lunch. But there were other things, Pinochet, the expansion of the Vietnam War from Vietnam into Cambodia. There were a lot of things that the liberal student body was upset with, and this all got blamed on the SDS, and specifically the weathermen of the SDS, who vehemently denied that they had anything to do with the bombing of the Semitic Museum. But as a consequence, this is actually how I got involved, indirectly. Because when they blew up the Henry Kissinger's office, and the skylights shattered and glass came down, when they went to clean up, one of the first people to go in there was Carney Gavin, my mentor. Around the time he was writing his thesis, he was not quite yet the curator of the museum. And he went in there and he discovered boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff that had been delivered to the military that were meant for the Semitic Museum. And then they opened up these boxes and they found a wonderful collection of photographs from the turn of the century, what's now called the Bonfils collection, which chronicles not only the life in Mesopotamia at the turn of the century and a little bit earlier, maybe the 1860s, 1870s, but it also shows the archaeologic activities going on in 1912 when we first started looking at the Levant and digging things up. Well, actually, that's not true. There were expeditions in Ur and in Uruk that were being done by Europeans. But the United States got involved in archaeology, specifically Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, and University of Chicago worked together on some projects that had not been hitherto explored. Around this is part of the Bonfils collection. This is actually the Tower of David as it appeared in 1890 something. It doesn't look this way anymore. And we were able to start to piece together what was really going on in the Levant and tie in what was being dug up and delivered to the various academic centers with where they were on the ground at the turn of the century. We were able to place the items. These are pictures from the Bonfils collection. The West Wing, the Wailing Wall. These are all from the turn of the century. Here's archaeological site. There must have been thousands of photographs discovered, and my mother, I have a handout here. There's this article about how Carney Gavin describes my parents as discovering that there was not one Bonfils that did all these photographs, but actually two brothers who went around the Middle East taking pictures. The earliest photographs we have, and they used a camera that looks something like this. It was, this is from France. These were made in France. These stereotopic photographs were made. I don't know much about one of these cameras. I think I've seen one of these in my life, but apparently they made as good a picture as you can get from your iPhone. And we were able to link the artifacts with where the archaeology went on. These are all zoographic and pottery, three-legged things, pottery, all sorts of stuff as part of the Semitic collection. That, by the way, the public was not privy to, because the museum had essentially been closed down until the 80s. On this pottery and on clay tablets, we find the beginnings of language. This is glyptic. Does anybody know what this says? This should be obvious. Actually, it shouldn't be obvious.
Good morning.
It says something. This is the area of the world we're talking about. This is what the Babylonian Empire looked like. It overlaps with what we know as the Fertile Crescent. Yes, and this is a diagram of the Assyrian culture and the extent of their civilization around 700 BC. We're talking about, with the Newsy collection and the Harvard Semitic Museum, we're talking about 1,000 years before that, and dealing with the relics and artifacts of that time. But I want to go back earlier than that. Here's Newsy on the map. It's right in the foothills of these mountains, this green between the Tigris and Euphrates, was a very good place for human civilization to take hold. We had to develop, among other things, an ability to grow things rather than being hunter-gatherers. It was the beginning of farming. Now, how do we know that there were even people living there, and that we know there were people living there. There were people living there going back 7,000 to 8,000 BC. We know that. Aging, figuring out the age of things. How do we know they actually lived there? That they stayed there? They weren't just following herds of bison or whatever, being hunter-gatherers. Well, we know that by what we were able to dig up, what we found in the ground. Does anybody know what this thing is? A what?
Be a horse.
Yeah, it probably is a horse, but when I Googled it, it said pig. It's supposed to be this.
Pretty long neck.
Has a long neck. And I saw that, and I was, I kept the slide in there because it's in the hole. But this is what, if you find this, you found civilization. Why is that?
Domestic animal.
Pigs don't like to walk. They don't like to walk. So the first take-home lesson from this talk is that pigs don't like to walk. And if you find pigs, you found, you haven't found hunter-gatherers, you found people who actually set up shop. Now this is me around the time that I started working at the Semitic Museum, and the only reason I have this in here is I want you to see what I look like without a beard, because the entire time I've been in Kentucky I've worn a beard. In 1977, Gavin assembled, this is 3 or 4 years into his tenure as a professor and director of the Semitic Museum, he assembled a team of dedicated volunteers to sort through and document the Newsy collection. We had all these things in shoe boxes, as I recall. And we, broken pieces of clay tablets, and it was a mess. When we finally drove the CIA out of there, the SDS did. We took over the building and wanted to open up the museum to the general public, not just to the graduate students, to study these artifacts. So we needed money, because the university wasn't giving us money. I didn't know that. I just thought it was normal to be a volunteer and not get paid. But as it turned out, we did get money. We got money from this guy, this anti-Soviet warrior who helped defeat the Russians in Afghanistan. And then he blew up the World Trade Center. That was nobody. That's Osama bin Laden. One of the bin Laden family supported this Medic Museum, along with the royal family of Liechtenstein, which Carnegie Gavin had befriended when he was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford in between undergrad at Boston College and graduate school at Harvard. Before I go any further, I got to find out who you people are. I got to get an idea who I'm talking to, because this can get pretty messy. All right, I know this is some sort of a church gathering. You know what this is?
Michelangelo.
Sistine Chapel.
Right. And on the left, you can only see his genitals, his finger, but that's Adam. And this is some anthropomorphic deity. I can't, being Jewish, I can say God, but I can't say his name. If I write it, I have to write G-D, otherwise I'll be struck down by lightning. That's what I was told in Hebrew school. But if you believe that the earth was created in 7 days, and that the earth is only 5,000 to 6,000 years old, you're going to have a hard time with the rest of this talk. Okay? Now, if you believe this, we're cooking with gas. This is the evolution from a common ancestor of man. I didn't notice this here.
We all turned into TVs.
We all turned into
Regression.
If you believe in evolution, anybody in here believe in evolution? Just a couple of people? Well, maybe you will after the talk, I don't know. Then you're not alone. If we look at, and this is the only graph I have in here. I took all the graphs out of my chart for you people, because nobody likes the messy graphs like this. But if you look over on the left side, you see that, and this was a study done in 2008, and this is published in The Scientist magazine, of what percentage of the people believe in evolution, basically, which would be human beings as we know them developed from earlier species of animals. True. Well, if you're from Iceland and you're frozen 11 months out of the year and you just thaw out for about a month, those people, those idiots, about 84% of them believe that in evolution. And then a chunk of them are not sure. I guess they're still thawing out. Denmark, Sweden, France. There you are, Marianne. Japan. UK, Norway, Spain, Germany, We finally get, just before Turkey, to the United States, where a whopping 40% believe in evolution. Now, I would have put Ohio County on here.
There's a little game changer. It's a game changer.
So I'm up against, I have a hostile audience now.
At least we beat
Let me go back here to this slide. I have great sound effects. I guess we don't have the sound plugged in. That's okay. You're all familiar with this slide. This is, yes, this is somewhere around 900,000 years ago, if you go up this way, you got kingdom, phylum, class, order, superfamily, family, subfamily, tribe, genus, and then below this we would have what?
Species.
Species, thank you. And this is us over here, supposedly. If you broke off from this common group and you went in this direction, you became, what is this? Gibbon. You became a gibbon. If you made a little bit further, 2.5 million years, according to looking at bone structure and DNA evidence, specifically mitochondrial DNA, not chromosomal, but mitochondrial DNA. You have to make this choice whether or not you're going to become this, which is orangutan, or if you're going to become gorilla, or down here, let's see, how many, yeah, here. This does not mean loosen the loafers. This is us over here.
Is that chimpanzee?
And chimpanzees, not just chimpanzees. As it turns out, it's chimpanzees and bonobo. And what determined the separate genetic development of these two subspecies, or family, is this river, Congo River. Here comes our second take-home message. Chimpanzees can't swim, neither can bonobo. Couldn't cross the river, so they lived for thousands and thousands and thousands of years separate from each other. And a bonobo is like a small chimpanzee, and a chimpanzee is like a big bonobo. And they look very similar. In fact, some of the famous chimps you've seen in TV shows and movies are not chimps but bonobos. And they're different. They're a little bit different genetically, if you look at their DNA. And they developed differently because of that river. And unfortunately, this is a very unstable part of the world now, so we're losing our bonobos because of war and deforestation. And the chimps are doing much better. Thank you very much. How else do we know how old things are? Rutherford. About the same time the Semitic museums started, at a competing university in New Haven, Connecticut, at Yale, Rutherford started experimenting with uranium and finding out that it decayed eventually to lead. And they were able to figure out the beginnings of the science of carbon dating, or of determining the age of something by how fast it, or how slowly it decayed from one substance to another. That led us eventually to Gene Shoemaker, who you might recognize as the person sitting next to Walter Cronkite when we sent people to the moon. He was in the space program along with JP, and he's a colleague of JP's. He was not able to become an astronaut because he had Addison's disease. So in the 60s, we had two important figures who had Addison's disease. Who was the other one?
Kennedy.
Kennedy. Actually, Kennedy probably didn't have Addison's disease. He probably developed secondary Addison's disease from taking steroids from his back problem. But he had honest to goodness Addison's disease, couldn't become an astronaut, so he started doing other things at NASA. And one was basically studying how old things are based upon looking at meteorites. And in fact, he has an asteroid named after him, Shoemaker 7, which comes by every couple thousand years. And it was through the work of Shoemaker that we were able to pin down, and his colleagues at Caltech, the age of the Earth, of the solar system, and to try to get an idea of at least the age of some of the petroglyphs that were done in the Stone Age. So for instance, we know that this wasn't around at the beginning of the Earth 6,000 years ago. It predates it by about 6,000 years, this writing. It's called the five-fingered man. And this certainly is too old to be around in the biblical version of the genesis of the earth. This is a clay tablet with this figurine on it, pictograph, made from a cylinder seal. The cylinder seals is what I got to work with. I wasn't smart enough to work with glyptic, which I'll show you, cuneiform. This is something from around the time period that I was working with, which is 12 to 1400 years BCE, around the time of the patriarchal age. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, that time. And because of time constraints, I could probably spend a half an hour talking about what's in this picture. The upshot of all this is you've got somebody's signature. People couldn't write. Even kings and priests couldn't write. Only a handful of people could write back then. It was too hard to write. There was no real alphabet. You had to learn a language that consisted of marks in clay or on stone, and the vocabulary was somewhere between 450 and 800 different symbols. It's like Chinese. It's really hard to learn. So just a handful of people called scribes learned how to write back at the time that people signed their name in such a way. And if you look at this, you'll see, there's some sort of god with a mandala, and what else we got there? We got a phoenix, rising bird. We've got humanoid creatures with legs from an animal. These, of course, are the sun god over here. You've got stuff there that's really interesting, and I spent several summers trying to sort out what was on these clay tablets that were, 4,000 or 5,000 years old. Okay. This is what the tablets look like. This is from the Semitic collection. Except these are, mostly what you're looking at there, are these scratchings on there are cuneiform. That was the language. It was derived from Akkadian. The predecessor to that was the Sumerian language. And then this was followed by, there were intermediate languages like Hittite. And this stone is probably the beginning of Hittite. This is probably proto-cuneiform, just before cuneiform. And eventually it was all replaced by Phoenician. And I have a handout that gives you the Phoenician alphabet and compares it to all the modern languages that we have now, isn't it? This is, that's Hebrew. I keep on hitting the wrong button. I don't know why I'm doing that. If you look at these clay tablets, they have a front, a back, a side, a top, and a bottom. And for publication purposes and for research purposes, we photographed these, and still do, with all the aspects superimposed so that scholars can come by and look at these things. Here's a scholar, his name is Shvi. He came from Brandeis University, and he would come once a week, and he would look at the clay tablets that we were working with, and he would translate them, painstakingly translate them. This is like working a crossword puzzle. It's hard. That's a hard language. This is the stuff I worked with, glyptic, much easier. You get this guy, you got this guy, you got that guy, you got a tree of life, there's an eagle. That's a tree of life because it's got pomegranates hanging down from it. This guy's got a horn, you got a wonder, he's got a crown. You didn't have to know too much to copy this from the stone. you might have to be careful to copy what you see and what you think you see. Here's a cylinder seal. Anybody know what this thing is? Take a guess. This is somebody's signature. They would wear it around their neck, so that when they would sign a tablet, you know, they'd have a scribe write a tablet, maybe, you know, 15 hectares of wheat, or barley rather, for 2 slaves, a concubine, and 2 donkeys. You know, that all written on a tablet. They kept track of things. What's that?
Lion? A seal to mash into the wax?
Ram.
A ram.
A ram.
That's good. Who said ram? Yeah. 2 eyeballs, horns,
Oh, those are horns.
snout. Yeah, that's probably not a ram. Probably more like an elk. But see, you could be a
Archaeologist.
research artist at Harvard.
Yeah.
This is one of my published works from the Newsy collection in the 70s or 80s. I'm not really sure when this was published. And you can see, one of the things I want to point out is you got to be careful not to put lines that you know are there. But if it's been worn off the tablet, you know, you'd be cheating to draw in what you know is supposed to be there. So I was taught, that was the first time I was taught to write only what I saw. And here you have a helmeted griffin with 3 wings, and this guy wears a helmet. They all have Semitic noses, by the way. That's how you know they're Jewish. Let's see, what is this? Tree of Life, there's pomegranates.
This is like very early Dr. Seuss.
Yeah, it does look like that.
Yeah, especially with this bovine form over here. Yeah, it does look like Dr. Seuss. But as it turns out, it's people's religion. They're, you know, they worshipped many gods. You know, if you think of these cultures, these Bronze Age cultures, you have the Babylonians, the Assyrians, Hittite, the Hurrians. They all had, they weren't monotheistic. Monotheism began probably around this time, just maybe a little bit later. And it may have occurred in the northern part of Mesopotamia, where Newsy is located. Because we see in these in this writing, for the first time, discussions about the prodigal son. In order to transfer ownership from one person to another, you had to be related. So this began this system of the courts legally adopting people for the purpose of passing on land to them, so-called prodigal son for that purpose. And that's mentioned in the Bible. Rachel, Isaac. So you have the first evidence of that is probably around this time, and it pops up. It was discovered by the researchers in 1920s to 1930s, or 25 to 35, from University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and the Museum of the Orient at the University of Chicago, where many of our heroic archaeologists. Who's the guy that Steven Spielberg made the movies about?
Indiana Jones.
Indiana Jones was not from Harvard or Penn or Yale. He was from the University of Chicago. That's because they were way ahead of us. They had money. Harvard didn't have money. Harvard had anti-Semitism. I'm going to skip that. That's cuneiform. I had something to say about it, but we're short on time. I will go to this slide, though. If you want to study the evolution of written language, you have to go here, and you go back to about the year 3000 BC, where you have something that looks like a head, a nose, an eyebrow, was the earliest form of written language. It was a pictogram, a hieroglyphic, so to speak, that they have next door in Egypt, a little bit later. That was rotated 200 years later so that it looked like this, pointing out. That begat this, which was the first abstracted glyph. That is supposedly a head in as a cartoon. That became the contemporary writing somewhere between the Sumerian culture and Akkadian culture, where we started writing in true cuneiform by taking a reed, which was easy to find growing on the riverbed in Tigris, Euphrates. Take it, cut the end of it, get a piece of clay, plenty of clay, moisten the clay, and then you take the reed, we'll put this down, and you mash it into the clay. And instead of turning the reed, you turn the stone. If you want it going this way. Now this is an interesting transition from having 45-degree angle lines to this. This is the beginning of Hittite language. Hittite culture had that influence. About second millennium. That's Assyrian, old Assyrian, got rid of these diagonal lines and just had up and down. And then eventually, this became that, until the language died out and was replaced by a system where you had consonants and vowels. Actually, very few vowels in Phoenician writing. You had, and also, we had a change, this is a little bit eclectic, but we had a change from subject, object, verb structure, this way, subject, object, verb, to subject, verb, object, which we're used to in our language. And then the Phoenicians, you should look at the handout. I didn't think more than 10 people would show up, so I only made 10 handouts. I'm sorry. I'm thrilled there are this many of you, my friend. How are we doing? Are you getting bored? Are you falling asleep?
No.
Okay. We go from writing, laws, documents of ownership and transactions. How much wheat did you grow? How much of it goes to this god? How much of it goes to your neighbor? How much of it goes to the government? This had to be all written down and collected. And we found, literally thousands of these stones. So this is the first time we're able to actually look at the everyday life, not just monuments and etchings and monuments, but basically we opened up the filing cabinets of a civilization that lived 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Unfortunately, it all got hidden in the attic by the Army. And if it wasn't for the SDS, we wouldn't know about this. Here is, this is a copy of the flood tablet. We're getting towards the end, because I know you're getting tired and I'm filling up your brains with possibly useless information.
Interesting.
This is part of the Epic of Gilgamesh. There were more stories written about this guy, Gilgamesh, than there are about Jesus, or Moses for that matter. Gilgamesh was probably a Sumerian king, 2,700 BC, give or take a few. And he built a wall around Uruk, which was at the time the biggest city in all of Mesopotamia. It was in southern Mesopotamia, not like Uzi, which was in the north. And that's over here, I wrote the Hebrew word for Uruk. And if you pronounce it in Hebrew, it's Iraq. So that's where the word Iraq came from, which is where you would find Uruk if you were to dig it up. In Uruk, they didn't have writing. They had some pictures, some pictograms. They didn't really have a developed system of writing yet. And what makes it worse, as far as finding out about this culture, is they, you know, if somebody came along and knocked down a bunch of buildings or a church or temple, they just build right on top of it. So when you go to dig it up, you have to dig down below layers and layers of civilizations to get at an understanding of what was there, you know, 4, 5, 6,000 years ago. But they found this, and because of the work of people like Shri, were able to translate the cuneiform into probably the first story ever written. This epic of Gilgamesh, which I could talk to you about for an hour. But in short, this was a king who was considered to be 2/3 God, 1/3 human. Somehow the math escapes me. It's like being 1/3 Polish, because you only have 2 halves. And then he was dropped out of a window as a baby because his grandfather, who was also king, read an oracle or heard an oracle or somehow found out that his grandson was going to take over his kingdom, so he tried to kill him by dropping him out a window. But his fall was broken by an eagle, and he survived, and he was raised by peasants. He returned to Uruk to become king. He made friends with a Neanderthal, we think, who was sent by the god Isis, legend has it, to seduce Gilgamesh. I should show you Gilgamesh. That's Gilgamesh. To seduce Gilgamesh, and he didn't buy that. The guy that he was then sent to defeat him in battle realized Gilgamesh was stronger than the Neanderthal, this hairy creature from the woods. They became buddies, and then started going on all these adventures. Actually, that kind of looks like me. He's got a cat, he's wearing a bathrobe, he's holding a snake. And he's got his watch on backwards. Gilgamesh, we know from at least the artifacts that are left, and his buddy had to defeat Taurus, who was sent as a second obstacle to his rule. This is Taurus the bull. Actually, it looks like a person, a Jewish person. He, according to all the versions that we see in the literature that is 3, 4, 5,000 years old, he smote him. That's in the process of smoting. And this winged Taurus beast with a horn, you can see he's holding onto the horn. He cut off the leg, threw it at Isis, and then Isis decided to kill his best friend, who she originally sent to kill him. It brings up an interesting notion of you know, how much of this is real. Well, the things that were written, they've actually gone and dug up. You know, this story of a great door to cover this doorway being so many cubits. There's the doorway. They found it in where Uruk was supposed to be. They dug it up. A lot of it is probably embellishment, just like the Bible. But this precedes the Bible by thousands of years. Okay? And just a couple more passing thoughts is life in 2700 BCE was not unlike life in Owensboro. This is a banquet. These people are getting drunk off of beer. So they drank, most of the time they drink it through these long straws. You see somebody passed out over there. Here's a goblet. This is depiction of a banquet. And according to this archaeologist from the University of Pennsylvania, that's Patrick McGovern, he's actually made a whole career of taking the plants that were available at the time and brewing beer to prove that it was pretty easy to make beer 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Among other things he did as an archaeologist. The Semitic Museum is in good hands. This is Adam Asia. He's now taken over as the curator of the Semitic Museum. Those are the clay tablets and the familiar drawers that my mother started as the archivist of the Semitic Museum in the 70s. And they're now protected with little styrofoam holders. And they're in the process of taking roughly 5,000 important documents and refurbishing them because they've accumulated salt from the air and they're starting to crack and crumble and be hard to study. So they came up with a process of rebaking them. They were baked originally because of, a lot of the time, not because of being laid out in the sun for permanently storing these important documents, but they were baked in the process of wars when the Assyrians conquered Nuzi in the year 1200 something BC. They lit the city on fire and they cooked the stones, cooked the clay tablets. So they preserved them, but some of them cracked. And I remember a lot of my time was spent trying to put together these jigsaw puzzles of stones so that people could read them and figure out what life was like 5,000, 6,000 years ago. That's about all I have to say. That's all I think I should say. I've gone longer than I was supposed to. They told me this talk, as I came in here this morning, it should be 15 minutes. But I've only seen one person leave the room, so I must be doing okay. This is Tracy, by the way, in front of the Semitic Museum about a year ago. If you have any questions, I might be able to answer them.
No, I'm getting ready to take the mic down, if somebody has a question.
Ben, you've got to ask a question.
Great talk.
Yeah,
Yes,
very
I
good.
enjoyed it. You need to come back. Come back to me like you had tons of stuff.